My name is Thomas Cassar, and I'm from the Entomological Society of Malta. We're basically a society which studies insects and related organisms in the Maltese Islands. Now, there are approximately 4,500 different species of terrestrial and freshwater arthropod in Malta. And when we talk about arthropods, we mean invertebrates which have jointed appendages. So we're talking about crustaceans like lobsters, crabs, woodlice, also myriapods like centipedes and millipedes, but also insects. Now, insects are the largest group by far of all the arthropods and indeed all of the animals on planet Earth. And we have about 4,000 different species in Malta that we know of, because every year hundreds of different species keep on being discovered and studied. Now, perhaps the most familiar of all of the insects are the moths and butterflies. And in fact, these have been very well studied in Malta, and we have about 600 to 700 different species. But moths and butterflies belong to one order called Lepidoptera. Now, an order is an insect group which contains all of the insects in that group which have a shared similarity, a unique characteristic. And there are many different orders. There are the beetles, the order Coleoptera, there are the dragonflies and damselflies, the order Ordonata, and so on and so forth. Now, the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, are grouped together because they all have one characteristic, which is that their wings, which are actually transparent in reality, are covered in thousands upon thousands of shimmering scales which give them color. Now, we like to make a distinction between moths and butterflies in common language, but actually scientifically there's very little which separates them. Now, what we call a moth tends to be a sort of nocturnal, drably colored insect which holds its wings flat at rest. But a butterfly is an insect which holds its wings vertically. But of course, there are many, many exceptions. And in fact, we only have a handful of butterflies in Malta, but the rest of the 650 or so species are all moths, and many of them can be actually very beautiful. So for example, the family Sphingidae, the hawk moths, contain some of the largest moths, not only in Malta, but also in Europe. We have the death's head hawk moth, for example, which has a 13-centimeter wingspan. But we also have much more common moths, such as the spurge hawk moth. Now, this, until a few years ago, was known as Hyles titimali sammuti because it was named after a Maltese Lepidopterus. But recent genetic analysis in 2019 has found that these are actually the same species which occurs in mainland Europe. So now we call them all Hyles euphorbiae, because they feed on plants of the genus Euphorbia. And another difference between moths and butterflies is the way in which they pupate. So the transitional stage between caterpillars and the adult, we call that the pupa. Now, in butterflies, it's sometimes also called chrysalis. Now, butterflies like to pupate out in the open. So they'll just climb up on a stick, climb up on a wall, and pupate. But moths do it differently. They like to be protected. So what they do is either spin a nice silk cocoon around their pupa so they're nice and safe. In fact, that's where we get silk from the silkworm, which is actually the caterpillar of Bombyx mori, the silk moth. Or else they will either just bury deep into the soil and pupate underground. Now, you might say that this is a bit dangerous. What if it rains? What if there's a mold outbreak? But somehow or other, these moths can actually find a nice patch of soil and dig a pupal chamber in the soil and be protected from the elements. Okay, so during pupation, what happens is that the caterpillar stage, the larval stage, its job is just to feed and grow. It has no other job in life. It needs to feed as much as it can and grow to the maximum size that is obviously designated to each species. So once it reaches a final size, it can't grow any bigger, it will stop eating and find a very nice, quiet place where it won't be disturbed. This is very important because pupation is a very slow and gradual process. And during that time, the caterpillar will be completely vulnerable and defenseless. So if a bird comes along or a lizard comes along, it won't be able to defend itself or run away. So it needs to find a nice, secluded place. Now here what happens is that things start to slow down. It stops eating, and the outer skin, the outer exoskeleton of the larva will start to harden. Now, the larva will start to shed this skin to reveal the pupal case, which is another hardened layer beneath. And inside the pupa, although it looks motionless, although it looks like all activities have stopped, inside is a very dramatic part of the butterfly or moth's life. Things are going to be rearranged, things are going to be dissolved and put back together. But the foundation of the larva is still there. And in fact, studies have shown that, for example, smells which have been introduced to the caterpillar in its larval stage are still recognized after it hatches as an adult. So for example, a caterpillar which has been shown a smell of a poisonous food, for example, will then still avoid that poisonous substance even afterwards, because it remembers from its larval stage. So not all things are lost. The biggest differences are, of course, that they will start to gain wings, the mouth parts will change completely. Remember, the larvae must feed on leaves, so they have mandibles to chew. But the adults feed on nectar, which is a liquid, so they need a long straw-like proboscis. Obviously, as well, the legs will change a bit, because caterpillars actually have 3 pairs of true legs, which are attached to the thorax, but they also have a number of pairs of what are called prolegs. Now, what are these are actually not real legs, but fleshy suction pads, which help them to stick to twigs. Now, adults don't really need these, so they're lost completely after they emerge from the pupa. Now, moths like to cover their pupae in a nice silken cocoon, usually, and this is where we get silk from silkworms, which are the larvae of a type of moth. Now, the legend says that silk was first discovered or used when a Chinese princess was taking a nice cup of tea underneath a tree, and one of these silkworm cocoons fell into her tea and unraveled. And she noticed how this could be made into a fine garment. Of course, it's myth, but it's been done for thousands of years. What actually goes on in the silk industry is that these caterpillars are mass reared on different leaves, such as those of mulberry trees. And then, once they pupate inside their cocoons, they are then killed, and the silk is unraveled as a single strand from their pupa. It's a very long strand, but it comes out just as one. Now, the largest variety can be found in the beetle group, and the beetles are grouped together on the basis of a unique characteristic called their elytra. Now, the elytra are nothing but the hardened wing casings which protect the rest of the body and the flight wings. Now, these wing casings can be so useful that some beetles have evolved either to lose completely their flight wings and fuse them together to become tanks, or else at least reduce a bit their flight wings so that they can fit closer together. Now, the elytra both protect the beetle from crushing forces and also prevent water loss. So they're very important for desert species and beetles that live in arid environments, and these beetles actually tend to close up all of their segments together. Now, in Malta, we have up to 1,200 different species, and probably more which are yet to be recorded. And we have many different families which differ greatly in the way they look and the way they behave. So, for example, the rove beetles are very elongated and have very reduced wing cases. They almost look like earwigs. And one particular species has a very endearing name in Maltese. It's known as Katarina Ledembe, which means Catherine, raise your tail. Because when it's disturbed, when it's threatened, it opens its mandibles wide open and raises its tail over its head to look like a scorpion. And if that doesn't work, and you've really bothered this poor beetle, it will evert 2 white glands from its abdomen, which really smell bad, and it will try to wipe them on you. So you will get a fright and you'll get a bad smell as well. But the rove beetles are a bit unusual for beetles because they look so different. But other beetles, such as the darkling beetles, are your classic, what we call in Maltese, Humphus. They are large, black-colored beetles which either roam around in your basement or in the countryside. But what you want to remember when you see one of these darkling beetles is never to pick it up, because they'll immediately release a dark fluid which will actually stain your hand and you won't be able to wash it off for quite some time. Another beetle which is able to release this liquid, which is actually its own blood, called hemolymph, is the blister beetle, and these beetles are a bit more sinister. Now, these beetles are very toxic. So if you were to eat one, and in fact someone did in 2011 and almost died, you would have very terrible consequences, because they release a substance known as cantaridin. Now, this cantaridin is very, very bad for your kidneys. So even cattle and sheep have know to avoid these beetles. When they feed on pastures and they feed on the fields, they will leave the clump of grass in which these beetles are found alone, because they know that it's a big problem. And in fact, that's why it's called an oil or blister beetle, because upon being disturbed, they will release oil-like droplets from their legs. And it's very important not to touch these beetles. Admire them from afar, but don't touch them or eat them. Other beetles are more familiar with us. So for example, the ladybirds. The ladybirds are very useful beetles because some of them feed on aphids, which are very harmful insects on our plants, and some of them actually feed on mildew, a very bad fungus which can be found on our crops. Another group of beetles which is very colorful, like the ladybirds, are the leaf beetles, the family Chrysomelidae, and we have actually over 60 species in the Maltese Islands. Now, unfortunately, some of these beetles are much maligned by gardeners and farmers because they feed on crops. So, for example, the vine flea beetle, which came in about 2011, is devastating all of our grapevines. But there are other species which are actually very nice and can only be found within our region. So, for example, Chrysolina variolosa, the variable leaf beetle, can only be found in Sicily and Malta. So it's a very special species which we should cherish. Other beetles are much larger and much more noticeable, such as the scarabs and flower chafers. Now we have Rhinoceros beetles in Malta. We have actually 3 species, the largest of which is not that common, but can be found around places where there are trees and rotting wood. But another species is much more common and can be found in September and October, when they emerge in thousands upon thousands of numbers, swarming around trying to find a mate, and unfortunately they start to gather beneath street lamps and sometimes get run over by cars. But it's a very noticeable species because they emerge in such large numbers. And of course they're called rhinoceros beetles because the males have a large horn on their head which they use. Well, the Maltese species don't really use them for fighting, but other tropical species do. It's more of a show of strength. The more protein as a larva that this beetle ate, the larger the horn on their head. So females will know that this beetle, this male, is a suitable mate and will likely be a stronger and fitter mate for them. Another fascinating group is the Hymenoptera, the bees, the wasps, the ants, and the sawflies. Now earlier I said that beetles are the most varied group on Earth, but in fact scientists now think that that's only because beetles have been studied so much. The wasps and bees unfortunately haven't received that much studying and are probably number much greater than beetles. This is because there are thousands upon thousands of species which are parasitoids, meaning that they take advantage of other species, laying their eggs inside their tissues, and so you can reason that for every insect or other there will be its corresponding wasp parasitoid. And if that is true, that means that we probably have many, many more wasps than beetles. Now, the wasps come in various shapes and sizes. Most familiar to us are the social wasps, such as paper wasps and hornets. Now, these are known for building very beautiful nests out of paper. But actually, what we call paper is just chewed plant fibers and wood, which are put together by the wasp with its own saliva and water. And in fact, humans got the idea to make paper from wasps. And in these nests, which are just masses upon masses of hexagonal cells, you'll get anything from eggs, larvae, queens, workers, and so on and so forth. Now, unlike in the ants, in which all the workers are usually sterile, they can't lay eggs, in some paper wasps you will get some workers which are able to actually take over from the queen. But this is a very complex affair, especially in the Mediterranean, where we have quite a lot of different species of paper wasps. And they each have their own style of taking up a nest. Some of them are actually social parasites and will take over the nest of a different species. Now, the hornets are the largest social wasps of all. And despite what many people think, the Oriental Hornet is actually an indigenous species, meaning that it's been here for a very long time and it's part of the native wildlife, even though it's called an Oriental Hornet, because it's more common in the East Mediterranean and Asia. Now, the Oriental Hornet is actually, well, if you don't bother it too much, quite a harmless species and actually a very good pest controller, because although the adults feed on nectar and sugary substances, they have to collect other insects for their own larvae to feed on because they need protein. So they'll catch anything from moth larvae, butterfly larvae, flies, even other wasps, and catch them and bring them back to the nest to feed their young. So they're actually very useful in our environment. Other wasps are not social. They live on their own, and they will make a nest. One female will make one nest burrow. So you have digger wasps, such as different mud daubers, which will, for example, create a nest out of mud, literally. They will collect soil and then mix it with water and then make it into a very nice, pleasing dome-like structure, or even like a vase. And inside, depending on the species, they will put many paralyzed spiders or even paralyzed caterpillars and lay a single egg on them. And then their larvae will hatch and feed on this fresh stock of paralyzed caterpillars or spiders and then emerge as adults themselves. So they're actually very interesting solitary wasps. Other wasps, as I said, are parasitoids. So they will lay their eggs inside an insect, and even as this insect is alive and feeding and keeping with its life cycle, inside it, the egg of the wasp will hatch and feed on its internal tissues. And then the host will eventually die and the wasp will come out. And they can do this to every sort of arthropod, terrestrial arthropod there is out there, with the exception of crustaceans. So they can even attack spider eggs, spiders, even the eggs of other insects, anything from beetles to other wasps to flies. Every single species can be a target for some wasp. There also, obviously, some of them are very specific. So some wasps will only attack aphids, some wasps will only attack other wasps, other flies. But generally, every group of insect has its own parasitoid wasp. In fact, one of the largest parasitoid wasps in Malta is the scolet wasp. And what these wasps do is that they can fly over the soil and detect where there are beetle grubs simply by smelling the pheromones that are released from this beetle grub's exoskeleton and even from the feces left by this grub in the soil. And what they will do is that as soon as they detect the presence of a rhinoceros beetle grub, they will land and start digging and then deliver a paralyzing sting and then lay an egg on the larva, and the larva hatches and feeds on the grub. Another member of the order Hymenoptera, so they're related to the wasps, are the bees. Now, we tend to think of bees as just, those honeybees which we rely upon so greatly, but there are actually loads of solitary species which are as important, if not even more important, for pollination. We have leafcutter bees, which will go out and find very soft leaves, such as those of the Judas tree, and cut neat semicircles out of the edges, and then take them back to the nest site where they will line the tunnels. And this helps to keep the food fresh for their larvae. And what they will do is that inside these tunnels, they put nectar and pollen for their larvae to feed on. But these are solitary bees, so it will be just one female making one nest for her own larvae. They won't be living in hives like honeybees. We also have mason bees, which are capable of building waterproof, durable, dome-like nests, which are attached to buildings. And similarly, they also feed their larvae nectar and pollen inside and then seal them up with mud and gravel. Now also we have bees which take the easy way out and parasitize other bees, and they're called cuckoo bees for obvious reason. Now these bees will visit the nest of another bee, lay an egg quickly and leave, and then its own larva will hatch, eat the larva of the other bee, and then eat the provisions of nectar and pollen collected by the other bee in there. So we have a lot of backstabbing from the bees within that group. Now, one of the less appreciated groups of insects, are the flies. And I'd like to refer to them as the true flies, because many other insects have flies in their common names, such as butterflies, dragonflies, and so on and so forth. But the true flies have the unique characteristic of only having two functional wings, so that's one pair of functional wings. The second pair of wings have actually been reduced to knob-like structures known as halters. And what these halters do is that they allow the fly to detect the inclination of flight and little pressure differences in the air, and help it to be extremely acrobatic in the air and fly around. And we've always seen these zigzagging hoverflies and so on and so forth. And they can actually detect different changes in the air pressure as they fly. And that's what these halters do. They allow them to be very acrobatic in the air. Now, the largest fly in the Maltese Islands is the crane fly, which is actually very harmless. Although many people think it's some sort of giant mosquito, the adults can't even feed at all, and they have very short lifespans. The larvae feed on decaying organic matter in the humid soil. But it's actually a very harmless species, and in Maltese we refer to it as nemusoon, even though it's not related to mosquitoes, the nemus. Other flies have completely aquatic larvae. And what they do is that they live in ponds and ditches and feed on the organic debris that fall into the water. And to breathe, they can use a siphon, a snorkel, sort of, from their rear end, which can reach the upper surface into the atmosphere and take in air from that. So they're very well adapted to the aquatic lifestyle. And we have many different flies which do this, including some of the hoverflies and even some of the soldier flies. Now, the hoverflies and even some of the bee flies are excellent mimics of bees and wasps. So they have fuzzy hair, they have bright yellow and black coloration, and this helps them to mimic bees and wasps so that predators think they have a sting, when in fact they're actually harmless. Now, for hoverflies, this is much less sinister than for the bee flies, because all they do is just want to mimic their stinging bee counterparts. But for bee flies, it has a dual purpose. Their mimicry of bees is not only simply as a protection measure, but also because they parasitize other insects, most notably the bees. So a female will quickly go to a bee's nest, flick in an egg, and then leave the site. And hopefully its appearance will be mistaken for a fellow bee, and so it will not be immediately attacked. The order Orthoptera in the Maltese Islands is represented by around 40 different species. In Maltese, we refer to them as Jurati or Reza. Now, what separates crickets and grasshoppers from the rest of the insects is that they have very strong, powerful hind legs, which they use to jump if disturbed. And in fact, many of these grasshoppers are extremely difficult to catch, even for entomologists, because as soon as you try to swing a net at them, they'll jump very far away. But also, many grasshoppers, for example, are excellent flyers, and they can migrate very long distances. So, for example, the Migratory Locust, which also occurs in Malta, is capable of reaching mainland Europe from North Africa. And often we try to think of migration as something which birds do, but actually insects have been migrating through the air for thousands of years, even before birds even evolved, probably. And other parts of the Orthoptera might not have this adaptation of the thick hind legs, such as the mole crickets, which have very thick front legs but normal hind legs. And what they use their front legs for is to dig into the soil and create extensive tunnel systems, which is why they're known as mole crickets. In fact, their Latin name, Grillotalpa, that's what it means mole cricket. Now, the mole crickets are very elusive creatures in Malta and also very difficult to study, not only because they live underground, but often you need to analyze their DNA and record their calling song as well to identify them. So it's a bit of a mystery as to which species occur in Malta for now. Now, the difference between grasshoppers and crickets is not often very obvious, but it's quite easy when you look at them. Crickets have very long, thin antennae. They almost look like hairs. And they also have a visible egg-laying tube. It's known as an ovipositor. In some species, it looks like a sword. In grasshoppers, the antennae are very short and very thick, and they will never have a visible egg-laying tube. Now, the group Hemiptera includes many different insects which have loads of different common names because they're so important to us. So, for example, in this group, Hemiptera, we have the aphids, which are important plant pests. So everybody knows about aphids. We also have cicadas. Now, the cicadas are extremely large insects, which we also have in Malta, which make a very loud noise, especially the males, during summer. In fact, this calling song of the males, which erupts from olive trees and pine trees during the summer, is so characteristic of Malta that it's actually been mentioned in literature up to 1840s. So we know that cicadas have been here for a very long time and that people have known about them for a very long time. But it's actually quite difficult to find a cicada on the tree because they're so well camouflaged. But the calls of the males, which they use to court females, are very loud indeed, and they characterize our summer. We also have in this group what we call true bugs. Now, although it might be tempting and indeed convenient to call all insects and creepy crawlies as bugs, scientists make a distinction between true bugs and the rest of the insects. A true bug is an insect which can feed by sucking. It has a sort of straw-like mouth part, or like a needle, which it can use to poke into a plant tissue or animal tissue and suck up the fluids. Now, we have many different species of true bugs in Malta, most of which feed on plants. But for example, the assassin bug is able to ambush flower-visiting insects and suck up their body fluids. Now, for those species which feed on plants, they have an added bonus for feeding on their tissues. First of all, you have a constant supply of amino acids and sugars by feeding on the plant sap, but also, if you feed on a very toxic plant, you can actually use that to your advantage. So many true bugs will actually sequester these toxins. They will grab these toxins and put them inside their own flesh, so that they are very distasteful, they are very unpalatable to predators. And they will actually advertise this toxicity by having very bright colors. It's called Apostomatic Colors. And so you will find many black on red colors, black on yellow, black on white even. And in fact, one of the most common true bugs in Malta, the soldier bug, has black and red colors because it feeds on many toxic plants. And for example, if you were a bird and tried to feed on this insect, you would have a very bad stomachache. And if you were to eat a lot, probably some even worse consequences. So they have very bright coloration to advertise the fact, hey, you know, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. Other insects from the Hemiptera include leafhoppers, froghoppers, some of which can actually, in their nymphal stage, in their young stage, can produce a very nice covering of bubbles that almost looks like spit. In fact, in England, they refer to it as cuckoo spit because it's a sort of reference to that a bird might have spat, and it's there on the leaves. But it's actually a very ingenious protective layer which keeps the nymph from becoming too dry, and it also hides it from predators. And they produce it as they're feeding on the plant sap from the liquid. And then this is lost as they become adults. Unfortunately, one of the most hated groups of insects are the cockroaches, the order Blattodea. Now, unfortunately, they get a bad rep because some species invade our homes and feed on food scraps and so on and so forth. But actually, as a whole, this group of insects is largely harmless. And there are many different species which actually don't even want to come close to us. For example, in Malta, we have the Egyptian roach, which burrows deep into the sand and practically doesn't see the light of day. It only comes out during the night. And what's interesting about this species is it's practically the only insect species in Malta which has different nicknames for the different sexes in the Maltese language. So, for example, the males of this cockroach will be known as patri, or monk, and the females will be known as soru, or nun. And this is because the exoskeletal plate on the thorax extends over the head and makes it look like they're wearing a hood. So they look like a monk or a nun. And this species is also very interesting because only the males have completely functional wings. The females are very spherical and lack wings altogether. So they look like nymphs or younger stages. And you will practically almost never see these females because they spend most of their time buried underground. But the males will come out during the night trying to find a mate. Now, the dragonflies are also very familiar insects to us because they are so large and so elegant as they fly. But what not many people know is that they're voracious predators in both their adult and larval stages. In fact, the larvae have a special protruding mandible beneath their jaw, which is like an elbow, which can shoot out at very fast speeds and grab tadpoles, fish, and other insects, and then eat them alive. The adults have a less sophisticated way of capturing prey, in that their legs are covered with very stiff hairs, so that whenever they are flying and they see an insect flying around, they can capture it and sort of hug it, and it becomes a sort of basket which keeps the insect trapped until they can eat it. And for dragonflies, sight is a very important thing. They have very powerful vision. In fact, the eyes are very bulbous and they occupy most of the space of the head. Now, the largest species of dragonfly in Malta is the blue emperor. And it's a very common species which can be found patrolling around freshwater pools. And it's actually very aggressive, as are other dragonflies, to other males. So if another male comes into its patch, they will fight, and often very violently, and some of them might even fall into the water and die. So for dragonflies, it's very important that you hold down a territory, because that's where you're going to attract your females. The praying mantises belong to their own order. And they were once thought to be related to grasshoppers and crickets, but now belong on their own. But they're actually quite related to cockroaches and termites. However, they are completely predatory. They hunt other insects, and they do this by means of their front legs, which have been modified to grab prey at very fast speeds. It's known as a raptorial foreleg. And that's why they call them praying mantises, because at rest, the front legs are folded as if they are in prayer. Now, the praying mantises of Malta are not that varied. We only have about 3 species and possibly another which went extinct about 70 years ago. But we have also some very interesting species. For example, one which doesn't even have a common name because it's so rare, and that's quite an uncommon thing for such a large insect, is Rivetina biotica. And it only inhabits, in Malta at least, the northern parts, so Laħrax tal-Millieħa, Pembroke, Nashar, places like that, and even Comino, but it's not even found on Gozo. And the thing is that this mantis lays its eggs beneath the soil, so it needs very loose and very healthy soil so that it can lay its eggs inside. And that's why it's so rare, because since the 1950s, much agricultural land and much open garrigue has been taken over by development. And so we've seen that up until the 1950s, it was occurring in Hattart and other central places, but now it's completely disappeared from there. And possibly within 20-30 years, if development keeps on going on as it is, we might lose this species forever. Now, this is the sort of study that we take care of at the Entomological Society of Malta. We document species, we record new species, we study the species which inhabit the Maltese Islands, and this is incredibly important because then we can start seeing the emerging patterns of how our insect biodiversity is changing throughout the years. And it doesn't look good. In the future, we might expect much less numbers of pollinators, for example, as more agricultural land is laid to waste, for example. We might also see a greater reduction in insect biodiversity, which is happening across the globe, but especially in insular, island environments where development is taking over. So we need to act now and start conserving our habitat and even promoting the growth of native wildflowers and native plants, because habitat is everything. Pesticides sure will affect, collections by amateurs will also affect, but the most important thing is conserving habitat, because that's where insects breed and that's where they have to go at the end of the day. So the more habitat we conserve, the better chance we have at conserving our biodiversity.